All right. Hello, everyone. This is Volts for June 18th, 2025. A win for transit-oriented development in Washington State. I'm your host, David Roberts. We need significantly more housing almost everywhere in the U.S., but nowhere cries out for increased housing density more than the areas around transit stops. Proximity to transit is the key enabler of car-free living. And where it is possible to live without a car, we should be putting in lots of housing to allow people to do so. What's more, when a transit stop becomes a node of dense housing, an entire ecosystem of businesses and services grows up around it. It becomes a dynamic hub. The notion of using transit stops as anchors for urban micro-communities, known as transit-oriented development, or TOD, dates back decades in the urbanist world, but the recent success of the YIMBY movement has put real legislative reform on the table for the first time in ages. And here, once again, I find myself bragging about my home state of Washington, where the legislature recently passed one of the strongest TOD bills in the country. To talk through that bill and TOD generally, I have two excellent guests. The first is Representative Julia Reed, a key sponsor of and advocate for the legislation. The second is Alex Brennan, who runs Futurewise, a Washington state advocacy organization that was instrumental in pushing the bill across the finish line. We are going to talk about why TOD is important, what's in the bill, how it passed, how it compares to bills in other states, and the next steps in the housing fight. All right, with no further ado, Representative Julia Reed and Alex Brennan, welcome to Volts. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Alex, I want to start with you just very quickly. So, for those of us who have followed urbanism, urban issues, et cetera, for years, the term transit-oriented development is very familiar. TOD is something that has been discussed in this world for a long time, but I suspect lots of people listening are not particularly tuned into those issues and not familiar with the nomenclature, not familiar with the idea. So maybe just by way of starting off here, maybe just give us like the 2-minute elevator pitch for what is TOD? Why is it important? Why is it an important focus of reform?
So transit-oriented development is, at its core, just allowing development near transit. And, why is that a good thing? You alluded to a lot of this in the introduction. Being near transit is something that is, really valuable to a lot of people. It means that you're going to be able to get places you need to go. It means that you're going to be able to not have to drive a car as much, which is going to have impacts on your quality of life, on your cost of living, and on the environment and on your greenhouse gas emissions. Typically, when we talk about transit-oriented development, we're talking about an area that is a short, easy walk to a high-capacity or frequent transit stop. And so different people can define that in different ways, but typically that's between a quarter mile and a half mile, sometimes even 3/4 of a mile from a station. And typically, you're allowing the sort of denser development within that walkshed, and that's for, the types of transit that you're thinking about are light rail, commuter rail, bus rapid transit, sometimes other types of transportation like a ferry terminal.
Maybe it's worth saying here that generally these reforms are not talking about just your average bus stop, right? Because there are like dozens and dozens of those all around any city with a bus system. And basically, if you did a half mile around every one of those, you would just be...
It would just be the whole city.
Basically upzoning everything everywhere.
Yeah. So actually, the original transit-oriented development bill did apply to just regular bus stops.
Yes, that is true.
But we ran into some trouble both with people saying, that's too many places. It was both people that were like, there were a bunch of concerns. I mean, cities in our area in Washington State, especially in the areas where there is the most transit, like don't generally operate their own transit systems. So there was sort of a hue and cry from the cities about like, well, what if Metro moves the bus stop and we've already built up all this zoning and then there's no transit to be oriented around. And then on the other side, you kind of had like an endless barrage of people trying to get their bus stop included, where they were like, because it was initially buses that come every 10 minutes. And then someone was like, what if it was buses that came every 12 minutes? Because then this bus stop could get included. And then someone else would say, what about buses that come every 17 minutes on weekends and every 9 minutes on weekdays? And then just in general, there wasn't enough political support to include regular bus stops. It just became too complicated both to fight the opponents and include all the proponents. So we narrowed that to bus rapid transit stops, which are a particular kind of bus mode.
Interesting. Very interesting background. So one other part I wanted to say by way of general background too, and maybe Alex, you're about to get into this, but like you were talking about the merits of living close to transit, the merits for people living in these places. But also, I just always want to say that like cities need tax revenue. They need development. If you're a city, you're growing or you're dying. And these transit hubs serve as like development triggers. They are little like, they're literally like planting seeds in your city around which development grows. So just like, you know, so often when you're on the internet, these things are framed as like do-gooders imposing these things on cities that are the poor, innocent cities that are fighting back. But like transit-oriented development is good for cities and city budgets.
And one other point on that I think is really important. In Washington State, certainly in a lot of other places, we're investing billions of dollars in building out a transit system.
Right.
And when we allow development to happen around those stations, then we're taking advantage of those investments and for the, building up the tax base, all the benefits I was mentioning, the people there. But so often we spend all of this money building these systems and then we don't let people be near them to actually be able to use them. And it's, and it ends up being a big kind of inefficient use of all of that.
Yes. As a resident of North Seattle, let me just strongly endorse all those comments. We've just spent billions of dollars putting light rail stops in northern Seattle. And like there's one that's like less than a mile from my house. And one whole side of it is just a sleepy, dumpy little single family neighborhood. And every time I see that, it just drives me insane. Like the amount of economic potential being wasted just like in that square mile is maddening to me. But actually this bill I think would literally upzone that area near me. So I'm personally excited about this. So Representative Reed, let's talk then about this bill. This is HB 1491. There's kind of three big things about this bill I want to hit. It's the upzoning it requires, it's the affordable housing it requires, and it's the way it pays for the affordable housing. Those, as I understand it, are kind of the three big things about this bill. So first, let's just start with the upzoning. What are the sort of details here?
Yeah, so this bill uses a form of density called floor area ratio.
Yes, please explain that. I've stumbled across that term 100 times now.
Oh, it's okay. I really worked hard on like, how are we going to explain this to legislators? Do we have diagrams? So basically the idea of floor area ratio is it's a division problem between the number of floors you have in a building and the amount of developable land you have on a plot. So if you have a one-story building that takes up the entire area of the plot, all of the land that is possible to be developed on that plot, that's a floor area ratio of 1. You could also have a 2-story building that takes up half of the land on the plot, or a 6-story building that takes up a third of the land on the plot. Does that sort of make sense?
And those are all a FAR of 1.
Yes. So those are all different types of FARs.
Right.
So that's one of the things that people ask a lot about is like, well, how many floors specifically does this allow? And the answer is it kind of depends. And we did that on purpose because every plot and lot is going to be a little bit different. And the way that it makes sense to develop that land is going to be a little bit different. So instead of telling developers like every plot in the TOD zone can have up to a 6-story building, you can kind of choose the level of density and development that you want to apply in each area.
So just to clarify, a 1-story building covering 100% of the lot is a FAR of 1.
Right.
So does that mean a 2-story building covering 100% of the lot would be a FAR of 2, just because it's 2 divided by 1?
Yeah, exactly.
So let's talk about then the FARs that this bill allows.
Yeah. So within this bill, it has different FAR levels depending on whether you are close to a light rail station or a bus rapid transit station. So if you are near a light rail station or a rail station, you have to allow a FAR of 3.5 on average. So again, that could be a 3.5-story building. I don't know what you do with that half story. That covers 100% of the lot. It could be a 7-story building that covers half of a lot. In theory, you could go up and up and up, but there's physics that are going to limit exactly how many floors you can have on that.
And so as you're going up and up, you're shrinking your footprint on the lot.
Correct.
To stay within your FAR. So if you wanted more than 6 stories, you would be building an extremely
yes
narrow building at that point.
Yeah, exactly. And I should say this is setting a floor that cities are allowed to permit. So a city has to permit at least 3.5 FAR within a rail station area. So that's within half mile of a light rail or heavy rail stop or commuter rail stop, essentially, or a density of at least 2.5 FAR within a bus station area, which is within a quarter mile of a stop on bus rapid transit. There are provisions in the bill that allow cities to average that FAR. So if within a half mile of the station doesn't really make sense, maybe a city wants to say, okay, we're going to actually allow much higher FARs in this area, on this block, and we're going to allow lower FARs on this block, but across that half mile around the station area, it's going to be an average of at least 3.5 FAR.
And that's the minimum. And so 3.5, a FAR of 3.5 is approximately 6 stories.
Yeah, we're talking 6-story, 8-story buildings. And this bill is really focused on building that really large scale building that you see around transit. So if you went to the Capitol Hill light rail station, I know it happened many years after we actually opened the light rail station, but eventually we did build those taller, denser buildings right on top of the station. That's what we're talking about here.
Of course, we say a 6-story building is some giant hulking building. But of course, if you go up to Vancouver, you go outside of Vancouver at their rail stops.
Yeah.
They're building skyscrapers around there. So
this is a floor, not a ceiling. So we could be doing more. And then also with around 2.5 FAR, cities are allowed to exempt some bus rapid transit stops up to 25% of the stops from this TOD. But if they do that, then the FAR and the remaining areas, the remaining bus stops, has to be higher. It has to be a 3.0 FAR.
I see.
So it's between a 2.5 and 3.5 FAR, depending on the mode of transit that the area is surrounding.
So approximate purposes, this is around 4 stories within a quarter mile of bus stops, around 6 stories within a half mile of rail transit stops.
Yeah, exactly. And if you do a building that is all affordable, so to people earning an income below 30% of AMI, or is what we think of as accessible housing, for example, which is people earning an income below 80% AMI. So that's your kind of teacher, firefighter cohort. If the whole building is tagged as being affordable for one of those groups, you can get an additional 1.5 FAR.
Interesting. So you can build up even higher.
Yeah. And you're also, this is kind of moot because we did end up passing the parking reform bill for the state, but there are no parking minimums allowed within the TOD zones under the bill.
Yeah, I was going to say, it seems like we already did this with parking reform, but honestly, if you have to kill parking minimums twice, you can kill them as many times as you want. And I'm going to cheer every time.
At the start of the session, we were very unsure if parking reform was going to pass. My first year, I was the prime sponsor of the statewide parking reform bill, and it was a rough. It
Yeah.
was a it was a rough crash to a fiery landing. So I think we wanted to be sure, in case we can't do statewide reform, we want to continue to chip away at these places where we can do parking reform.
So in these walk sheds around transit stops, parking minimums have been doubly killed.
Yes.
I know that, like, in the course of hashing out legislation, you make compromises that are opportunistic, et cetera. But, like, is there any logic to, well, like, for instance, half mile around rail, quarter mile around bus transit? Why, like, is there a logic there? Like, why?
There is a logic there. Whether or not it's a logic I personally agree with is a different conversation. But the kind of logic is that rail stops are fixed. They tend to be in areas where cities are already planning for a large amount of density, and half a mile felt like a reasonable amount of walking space. The argument was that bus stops tend to be more in neighborhoods. They're not necessarily in kind of places that cities typically think of as high density corridors. Some of the bus rapid transit stop examples some of the cities brought up were in quite rural parts of their city, or like places in between, like where kind of two cities meet, sort of in that unincorporated county area. And so there was a thinking that a more gentle form of density would be more appropriate around a bus stop.
But, like, if I'm a developer, I'm not going to go build a 6-story building next to a rural bus stop. Like, just because you enable these things with zoning doesn't mean people have to go do them or will do them against all economic sense.
Yes. Again, I agree with you. But as one vote out of 98 in a legislative body where I have to convince a lot of people who have varying levels of attention and interest in this topic.
Fair enough.
It's sort of one of the challenges in this is like getting legislators of all stripes, Republicans, Democrats, to say, like, you kind of have to let the market, like the market can drive here. It's a very tough sell, because, we're sort of here to try to ensure that the markets are well regulated and operating effectively. And sometimes I think it's funny that only in housing density conversations are progressive Democrats very committed to supply side theory. So sometimes you find yourselves in these really weird roundabout conversations. But
well, let me ask a couple of questions about this upzoning then. So, like, when I think of Washington State, I don't necessarily think of it as a particularly transit-rich state. So I'm sort of like curious, has anyone done the math on, like, what is the total, like, how big of a deal is this? What is the total amount of land that's going to get upzoned? How much transit do we really have in this state?
Yeah, Futurewise actually did do a study on that last year when we were doing the bill. Do you want to talk about that, Alex?
Yeah. So this was from last year. We were trying to answer that exact question. How much total added residential capacity would this bill create? And it's a lot. We looked at all the station areas, the amount of the current zoning compared to what these new minimums would be. And it added up to 1.8 billion square feet of additional residential capacity.
That must mostly be around bus rapid transit, right? Because that's like, are there a bunch of light rail systems in our state that I'm not aware of? Like, it's Seattle and who else?
Well, it is mostly actually, I should even caveat this. We only did this analysis for the Seattle metro area. We didn't do the other parts of the state that have bus rapid transit. So this is just in the Seattle metro. There's more in other parts of the state. And a lot of it is bus rapid transit. But, this also, we included not just the light rail stations that are already built, but the ones that are going to come online. And we are building one of the, we have the second biggest, light rail system expansion plan in the country in the Seattle metro area after Los Angeles. And so there are, growing number of stations and station areas. And I think a half-mile radius around all of the rail stations, plus the commuter rail stations, which I think people sometimes don't think about as much.
But it's fair to say that the bulk of the effect of this legislation is going to be felt in the Seattle metro area.
Yeah, kind of in the Puget Sound area. But I think one of the things that was really interesting about the Futurewise study for me was how much this unlocks in development on the east side of Lake Washington. And not just in residential, but like this also applies to it's residential and mixed use development, right? So that's more spaces for childcare centers, more spaces for small businesses.
Oh, wait, you're jumping ahead to one of my future questions.
Oh, sorry, we'll get there. But it's also more housing for people, and not just for tech workers, but for all the people that make those businesses run, like the bus drivers, the cafeteria workers, the custodial staff. There are a lot of people who I think when we think of like East Side technology hubs, worker housing, we think of the folks on sort of the highest end of the spectrum. And I hope this will help them too. But there are a lot of people who work at those companies and support those companies who want to live near transit on the East Side. And there's a ton of opportunity to unlock there. And like Alex said, that study didn't even include what we could potentially unlock in Vancouver and Spokane. And eventually, probably the Bellingham area. I know they're looking into bus rapid transit. So,
yes.
And also, it's not just King County, but Snohomish County also has a fair amount of bus rapid transit as well. And there's some opportunities in Pierce County too. So I would say kind of all across the sort of Puget Sound corridor, and then in the major urban areas, south and north and east.
Yeah. This gets to a question. This is, I guess, a political question for you, Representative Reed, which is, there's a lot of fighting over transit. There's a lot of resistance to transit. And now, is it the case that if I go add a bus rapid transit stop, I am also automatically upzoning the area around it?
Yes.
And if so, do you worry that that's going to increase the already substantial resistance to new transit stops? Like this makes accepting a transit stop in your area a bigger deal, I guess I would say.
Yeah, I think we looked at that as this is a risk that we're willing to take. When we're planning a transit system, it's a long-term plan. Yeah. You're investing a lot of money into it. And there's a lot of demand for transit and a need to kind of meet transit goals that are connected to climate goals, that are connected to budget issues, that are just connected to what residents themselves are demanding. So, could this potentially like add some of the, say, fuel to the fire? Yeah, but like those folks that are going to oppose transit stops in their neighborhood are going to do it whether or not, like they'll assume that the transit stop is going to lead to more housing and, more of those people moving in. Insert, whoever those people are for whichever community you're in. And so, and if not moving in there, it's going to be easier for them to get here. I mean, look at all the fights that were had, not to pick on Bellevue, but all the fights that were had with the Kempers the Freemans over like bringing light rail to Bellevue Square.
Yes, when you say this opens up a bunch of new opportunities for the East Side, that's the first thing I thought of was like, have you checked with the wealthy residents of the East Side about that?
They came to meet with me. Don't worry.
I'm sure.
But actually, I will say this, Bill, we had a lot of collaboration from East Side cities on this. So I had several meetings and tours. We had a lot of support from Kirkland and did a lot of work with kind of Bellevue. We really worked hard to try to get the cities to a place where at least they could sort of have enthusiastic neutrality about this. And I think, that was reflected in some of the give and take we had on the bill.
The politics around transit in East King County, I think, has really changed a lot from a decade or more ago when there were those fights about extending light rail and ways that you wouldn't expect. There can actually be more support sometimes in those cities.
Interesting.
Yeah, people are excited about light rail and bus rapid transit and what it is going to mean for their communities. And, I find that if you kind of paint the picture for them, they're like, oh yeah, this is something that we want. This is something our businesses support, our cities support, at least on paper. And then it's kind of getting down to like, okay, what are the actual like nitty gritty pieces of this?
Right. Well, this gets to the next question then, which you hinted at a little bit before, which is one of my main questions about all this, which is, you're trying to paint a picture for them. And when you're doing that, you're painting a picture of density, the kind of density that you and I like, right? There's open spaces, there's parks, there's green space, there's mixed use communities with shops sprinkled in. People are walking around. We're painting a picture of a nice little European city. But I think, like, if I live in Seattle, I was just talking with Alex about this before we started recording. If I live in Seattle, I do live in Seattle, up in North Seattle, up on very north Greenwood. And this is one of those areas where Seattle is zoned for density, but it's just a strip. It's just a big strode with density along either side of the strode. And then immediately beyond that, you have single family homes. So you have density, but like, it's not nice. It's not something I would want to paint a picture of. There's nowhere for any of these people to walk. Like, they have access to bus stops, yes, but like, it's not nice density. And so sort of two questions. One is like, is there anything in the bill that says anything about what kind of density we're going to get here? Or is it just more housing? You know what I mean? Like, is there any requirement that you include walkability or shops or mixed use or green space or any of the other parts of density that make density nice?
Yeah. Well, the bill does apply to an FAR for housing and mixed use development. I think anytime you're doing a statewide housing legislation like this, there is that challenge around how do you guarantee the most positive outcomes, given that this is going to apply to very different types of cities and communities. And also, you have to keep in mind that any requirement you layer on is going to cause developers and urbanists and other folks to point out that meeting that requirement is increasing the cost of building this housing,
yes.
which could decrease the likelihood the housing gets built at all. And we're
going to get to that too.
I'm sure, yeah, we'll get to that in a minute because we had a lot of round and rounds on this on the bill. So there aren't kind of like specifically like, okay, every one of these has to be a courtyard apartment with this much green space. But the idea is that this density is part of your comprehensive plan. So that's kind of what this is connected to, is that in your comprehensive plan, you must plan for this. And then within that kind of broader work of the comprehensive plan is where cities are supposed to be doing that work of thinking about like, how do we not just meet the requirements, but actually like build the kind of community we want and plan for the kind of communities we want.
I mean, this is my worry about like you mentioned this before, but like when you think of this as new housing for those people, like you're just going to build it as a bunch of warehouses, right? Like this,
yeah.
I'm worried about whether cities are going to do this well, I guess. I mean, it's only partially under your control, but
I mean, that is a worry that I have too. And I think you kind of lightly alluded to this, but I think we have a severe lack of vision within the city of Seattle from both the executive and the city council about creating a city that works and is centered around people and building a city that puts people ahead of parking and ahead of punishment and ahead of other challenges. And you can see this in kind of all of the sort of Sturm und Drang on the Seattle Comprehensive Plan. I regret that my city is not showing a level of leadership and vision on this issue that I would like them to see. Now, that being said, I'm a state representative, so I can pass statewide laws that provide kind of a container within this work to happen. But I'm not a member of the city council. I no longer work in the mayor's office. I can't guarantee you that your city is going to create this kind of planning. But that's where organizations like Futurewise are really important as well, because they are trying to hold cities accountable to this work. And we are also going to be creating, as part of this bill, the Department of Commerce is required to create model code that cities can adopt, just like they have model code for House Bill 1110, the Middle Housing Bill. And so in that model code work too, there may be opportunities to kind of bring out more about the quality of the neighborhood and the housing, not just the sheer amount.
Interesting. So the other piece is affordability requirements. And this is something that
controversial topic.
I'll briefly set the scene, right? There's a long-standing fight in urbanist world where I guess what you would call progressives or lefties want to say, if you're going to build, you are required to include some affordable housing, meet certain environmental standards, use urban labor, et cetera. All these sort of requirements they want to put on the zoning. This is called inclusionary zoning. It's sort of Yes, you can build density, but we have a lot to say about exactly how you build density. That's the left. And then you have the sort of kind of more center left YIMBYs who say, when you put all these requirements on new building, you make new building more expensive and you get less of it, which is what's happening. So this is a long-standing, very vicious, very heated, endless fight in urbanism world. And this bill actually includes the first interesting, sort of innovative way of cutting through that Gordian knot that I've heard. So I want to talk about it. So maybe just start, Representative Reed, with what are the affordable housing requirements in this? Hey there, everybody. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell you about a new mattress or push a credit card on you. This isn't an ad. There are no ads on Volts. It is supported entirely by listeners like you. If you'll indulge me for a second, I'd like to ask for your support. I started Volts because we're all surrounded by depressing news about climate change and misinformation about clean energy, and it's never been more important to share the stories of the real people on the ground doing the real work of transition, and all the ingenuity and courage and public spirit they are bringing to it. People are hungry to hear these stories, to learn from and find inspiration in them. I've heard from people who change majors or careers after hearing episodes of Volts, people using it in classrooms and community groups, even state legislators who have passed bills inspired by specific episodes. Sharing these stories matters. It makes a difference. If you have found value in it and want to help me continue doing it, I hope you will join the community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf. It's about the cost of a cup of coffee a month. If you don't like subscriptions, you can make a one-time contribution, leave a review on Apple or Spotify, or just tell a friend about Volts. I am grateful for any and all support. If you're already a paid subscriber, thank you. And now, back to the show. What are the affordable housing requirements in this?
It's a very complicated issue. And, I very much enjoyed when this bill passed being feted by the very people who the year before were calling me a climate arsonist for including affordability measures. It was a lovely lesson on legislative life.
Yes, can't take anything too seriously.
No, you got to keep it moving. Stay focused on the goal. So basically what this bill says is that for buildings that are constructed in a station area where it is newly upzoned for housing. So this is not all of the land in the station area because some of that land has already been upzoned to or above this level. So it is not everywhere.
Oh, so if I have a 4-story building that's in one of these areas already, when the upzoning happens, these affordability requirements do not retroactively apply to me. So it's only new building.
Correct. And if a city has already upzoned the area around transit and there's just not a building there, but it's already been upzoned to and above the level, let's say they're like, oh, we already allow 4.0 FAR
right
around our light rail stops. Those buildings aren't required to implement the affordability requirements either. It's new construction in newly upzoned areas.
Got it.
So in those areas, at least 10% of the units, if they're rental housing, have to be affordable to families making 60% AMI or below, or at least 20% of the units have to be affordable to households earning 80% AMI or below.
That's area median income.
Area median income. So just to put that in context, if you have a building with 10 units, that's 1 unit that's affordable.
Right.
If you have a building with 200 units, that's 20 units that are affordable.
And when we say you have to offer an affordable unit, that just means for that unit, you're capping the rent.
Yes.
At a low
least
level.
50 years.
Right.
And so this was a huge area of contention with the bill. I strongly believe that it is important that people of all income levels be able to take advantage of the transit utopia that we are trying to build. I'm unapologetic about that. I think that, yes, that does slightly increase the cost of building, but we're talking about building in the most profitable, most desirable, most in-demand property areas in the entire state of Washington. So there is room to accommodate a modest amount of affordability to ensure at least some people can either remain in areas that are going to be upzoned or can come to those areas for the first time. And I think that's especially important because of where we put our transit stops, often on these busy corridors, and
Yeah.
because of where we have already pushed low income people. And there is a element of race to this as well. So
Mhm.
low income communities and communities of color closer and closer to these busy, noisy corridors where we also often have transit that we're talking about upzoning. I see that as being different than middle housing, which is really actually about helping more low income people come into neighborhoods that they have been excluded from
Mhm.
because of exclusionary zoning practices. So I'm very unapologetic and always have been about having this inclusionary zoning level, but I've always been flexible about how we do it. I try to be outcomes oriented in this about like, how do we guarantee that some of the units built in these new areas are going to be affordable?
But do you concede the premise, though, that it is possible for inclusionary zoning requirements to slow building?
It's possible. I will say again, the balance of that is this is a very high demand building area. So it's possible. I mean, if a developer wants to build in Yelm where they don't have inclusionary zoning requirements, then they're welcome to do so. But I think that it is possible, but I also think that that's what you do in policymaking. We make trade-offs like that all the time. Like having a minimum wage means it's going to slow down hiring, but we should still have a minimum wage. Requiring hospitals to provide emergency care to anyone who comes in the door is going to increase the cost of providing hospital care. But I still think we should make sure that emergency departments are open to everyone. So yeah, inclusionary zoning requirements can slow down production and add some of the cost. But it can also mean that the neighborhoods we're building are actually the neighborhoods we want. And I think if we dial those dials appropriately, we can ensure that we're getting there.
Let's talk about then our clever solution here.
Yes. So developers get a lot out of this too. They're not just required to do inclusionary zoning. First of all, let's remind ourselves developers are getting an upzone, which means there's a ton of areas in these TOD zones where currently you can only build single family housing. So you can't build businesses, you can't build mixed use, you can't build any type of multifamily housing. So developers are getting a significant upzone. That's, I think, the first thing that they're getting. They're also going to be getting in this deal for areas that have this mandatory inclusionary zoning,
Mhm.
an extended tax exemption for their building. So this is actually work. I want to give credit to the city of Shoreline. They successfully piloted this in their city.
Oh, interesting. I was going to ask who came up with this?
Yeah, so it was actually the city of Shoreline. So
Go
they
Shoreline.
have a higher inclusionary zoning requirement than what's in the bill. They require, I think it's 20%. Well, anyway, it's higher than what we have in the bill. And they came up with this idea that instead of, I believe it's 12 years that you typically get a multifamily tax exemption, if you're a developer, we're going to give you 20 years. So you're going to get a longer tax exemption if you build for buildings that are in these areas.
So that means you pay no property tax on that building for 20 years.
Correct.
That seems like, what do I know? But that seems like a pretty big subsidy to me. Like,
it's a pretty big
who
deal.
did the calculation that equals the value?
It's something that developers sat in my office and said, like, this is our number one priority. And then we were like, oh, but I think they did that expecting we wouldn't give it to them. And then when we gave it to them, they were like, oh no, we want to veto this whole bill. So I thought that was kind of funny. And then in addition, I would note Senator Bateman added this in the Senate version that any property that's claiming this 20-year MFTE, the city also has to provide a 50% reduction for impact fees. So impact fees we haven't talked about yet. Typically, when you're building a development in a new city, a city will assess an impact fee to the developer that is supposed to kind of address the impact that having all these new people move to the neighborhood is going to have on sewers or water or schools. Now, there is a lively debate about whether or not those impact fees are actually like connected to any kind of like data.
Yes. And they definitely do slow down development,
Yes,
right?
and
They definitely do deter development.
and cities that don't want to have density, but lawmakers
Exactly.
who want to look like they're at least in theory in favor of density
Yes.
frequently do things where they say, well, we're going to allow upzoning, but we're going to put a huge impact fee on every development.
Yeah.
That's going to make it impossible. So then they can say like, well, actually, we changed the law. It's the developer's fault that they're not doing it.
Right. So this is a 20-year tax exemption from property taxes and a 50% reduction in impact fees.
Yes, if they are providing the affordable units.
Right. I mean, that seems, as you say, they're in your office saying that that's what they wanted. I'm just like, do we know? I have a couple of questions about this. One is, do we know from Shoreline's experience whether this is enough to pull developers in? Because part of what I'm wondering is, like everyone, I've been sort of traumatized recently watching federal policy flail around wildly from one direction to another. So, like, part of what comes to mind is just like, this is a 20-year commitment. Are developers going to trust that this policy is going to stay in place for 20 years? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's always part of the risk when you're dealing with public policy. There can be changes. I like to say that, they can take my word to the bank. So as long as I'm still here in 20 years, we can be sure of that. I think that in Shoreline's experience, it did spur development in their areas. So they had higher inclusionary zoning levels. They combined that with a tax exemption and incentive for developers to build despite those additional costs from the inclusionary zoning, and they saw greater development. I think I also saw a study that similar work had happened in Los Angeles, for example. So there's definitely places where this is happening and where we know that it's going to work. And yeah, I mean, I think in my office, we'll also have developers saying, well, it's impossible, it'll never pencil, but there's no pro forma to show that. There's no like data to back that. And I asked them, again, to be outcomes oriented. I was like, if you have a better idea, or if you have a suggestion about how we should dial the inclusionary zoning, like, I'm all ears. Like, I'm not saying it has to be this or it has to be that, but you got to come to the table with something. And there just wasn't a willingness to really engage, even though, as I said, developers are getting like 80% of what they wanted, 90% of what they wanted in this bill. So it's a little frustrating to feel like you're getting a lot of what you wanted. You're not getting 100% of what you wanted, but I'm not getting 100% of what I wanted.
Yeah.
Like, no one's getting 100% of what they wanted. That's not how this policy making works. And to sort of just continue to kind of fold your arms and say, well, we're not going to play ball unless we get 100% of what we want, means that you're going to have policy happen to you, not with you.
They're used to just winning. They're used to just being able to fend this stuff off.
Well, it's a new day in Olympia.
It's a new day. All right. Okay. So this is the three big pieces of the bill I wanted to go for. It increases the density around transit stations. It requires 10% affordable units. And somewhat innovatively, basically the community is paying for those affordable units rather than the developer via a 20-year tax exemption. So that's the bill.
The state is paying, but yeah.
The state is paying, taxpayers ultimately. So a couple of little other bells and whistles I wanted to mention before we move on. One, I think we touched on this earlier. It also eliminates off-street parking requirements. A double shot to the head of those
which is
parking
just requirements, not eliminating parking.
They can. Of course, I said it 50
every
times
day.
on the
I'm
parking
sure you
pod.
said it before, but
you can still build parking. It's not illegal. Another thing that I think is really cool, multifamily units that have at least 3 bedrooms are not counted toward the FAR limits.
That's correct.
Basically, so this means you can stick a bunch of family-size units in your building without triggering these FAR requirements. Basically trying to induce developers to build more family-sized units, which I just think is great because every city needs more of those. This is something that I feel like Vancouver's done a really good job on. You go walk around downtown Vancouver, there's schools, there's elementary school kids, there's kids everywhere. There's lots of family units there, but like those are hard to find.
Right.
In a lot of other cities. So
yeah, there's kind of a bias in our area where it's like, oh, well, single people live in apartments and families live in houses.
Yes.
And
let's kill that dead.
That's not the reality. Speaking as someone who's 38, like that's not the reality for me and a lot of my peers. And so
I mean, I would have loved to live in a big flat with my family if I could have ever found one that I could afford. One other bell and whistle, which I thought was really cool. Some of these, they say you have to allow increased density if you're using all mass timber. I'm sort of curious who stuck that one in. We love mass timber around here.
That's a great question. I don't actually remember who put in the mass timber piece. Alex, do you remember?
I don't remember that either. It's been in there for a while. I mean, I think part of the conversation about the types of buildings we're getting, there's a lot of interest in having more flexibility. And we have, right, a lot of this sort of very standard height kind of mid-rise buildings, and people wanted an option for slightly taller, more slender buildings with more green space on the lot. And our building code isn't very set up to do that. And so mass timber is a way to build at that height and to help kind of take advantage of the flexibility that the floor area ratio offers.
Excellent. Love it. The other thing is this bill exempts cities under 15,000 people. Again, this is true in the parking bill too. I'm assuming there's no substantive rationale for that other than just like a bunch of rural people are upset.
Oh, you never make assumptions, Dave.
Oh no.
That's what I call the Sumner exemption. There was the city of Sumner, which has a commuter rail stop, had some very strong feelings about but a very small kind of footprint had some sort of very strong feelings about how much of their city would be impacted by this. And sometimes in legislating, you make compromises in order to bring people on board and bring legislators on board. And that seemed like a fairly small one. So there's a very limited number of cities that are impacted by that because there aren't that many cities. The cities that are impacted by TOD to begin with are mostly large cities.
Right. So whoever that developer was who was so keen to go build a skyscraper in Sumner,
yes. If you were planning
Washington,
to build a skyscraper next to the Sounder commuter rail stop in Sumner, it's going to have to wait till the trailer bill.
All right. Let me ask about enforcement. I generally love this idea that's, I think, kind of really taken root in the YIMBY world, that it makes more sense to move the level of legislating up to the state level because at the local level, you just have disproportionate representation of certain populations, let's say, getting in your way and protesting everything. So I think there's a good argument to be made that doing things at the state level is not only more effective, it's also more democratic in a way. You are representing the needs of more people. But when you have a state mandate and you have a bunch of sort of smaller mid-sized cities that are vaguely resentful about it, I feel like you're going to have a lot of efforts to wiggle out of this in various ways or find loopholes or so. It's like, what is the mechanism of enforcement?
Well, we're one of the mechanisms of enforcement. One of the things Futurewise does is we bring legal appeals when cities and counties don't follow state land use law, and then the courts make sure that those folks come into line. I think the other piece, though, is that, this is just going to go into effect. I guess there's some work to do to figure out exactly the process. Representative Reed might know more about how Commerce is going to do this, but with the missing middle housing bill that we passed a few years ago, if you don't adopt your own zoning code to implement the state requirements, then there's a model state code that just goes into effect that you can permit under. And I assume that we'll have something like that will happen for this legislation too. Got
it. Okay, before I leave the bill behind, my last question, Representative Reed, is, and it's probably worth the whole pod too, but I'm curious a little bit about, when I talked about the parking reform, the sort of sentiment was like, this was impossible not very long ago.
3 years ago.
Like, things have changed quickly. Yes, things have changed quickly and made this possible. I assume that something similar is true of this, that this is a result of big shifts in opinion and power and coalitions, et cetera. So maybe just talk a little bit about how did you assemble a coalition to get this across the finish line when it was so difficult, not even very long ago?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, part of this is that housing is a problem now in every community, and it's the number one thing that legislators hear about in most cases. And that's not just Democrats, it's also Republican legislators. So right away, you have a cross-cutting issue that is very important to many different groups of people and that legislators are hearing about. So that automatically kind of increases interest. Futurewise was a huge foundational partner for this. And honestly, the people that every time I was like, I'm going to give up, this is too hard, kind of kept me going and kept me kept me pushing along. So shout out to Alex and your team for their incredible work and research. And also
dealing with NIMBYs is life draining. I can attest to that. So kudos to you for.
There's a lot of ways to have your life force drained in the legislature. Labor was a really important component of this. This is about building housing for working people and increasing their access to housing and their ability to live near housing.
And so they're on board. They were a force in favor.
Yeah, they were very supportive. The Labor Council came and testified this year, especially at all of our committee hearings. They were there at the bill signings. I really appreciated kind of the support of organized labor. I would say cities themselves, even though like cities are not known to be like the most excited about statewide zoning preemption.
That came up in the parking pod too. What is the organization of cities?
The Association of Washington Cities.
This was our sole opponent, was this organization of cities. Yeah. Is that true here
and the
too?
Association of Washington Cities, we could have a whole other podcast about my thoughts and opinions on them. But they, while the Association of Washington Cities was not supportive of this bill, individual cities who are actually the ones that are impacted by transit-oriented development largely were supportive, or at least we were able to work with them to get to neutral. So I had a lot of meetings. I went on tours. I really dialed into kind of who are the city proponents and what makes them support this. And then for the opponents, who are the opponents that have like real substantive issues that we could try to speak to in the bill,
right,
and who are the opponents that are just, never going to be down for any of this. And so, really working with the cities, because legislators listen to their city councils, they listen to their mayors, they listen to their residents. So it was important, especially suburban legislators, it was important that their cities at least feel heard in this process. So that was an important part of the coalition building. And we were able to work in their changes. The realtors and the business community, again, that was a community where even though if you ask the Washington Association of Realtors, they'll tell you transit-oriented development is one of their top priorities. They were opposed to this bill as
what?
Yeah, it's because they don't like the inclusionary zoning aspects. And even though, again, they're getting a lot of what they asked for.
Come on.
It's the same with NAIOP, which is like the commercial developer lobbying group. Even though they were getting 85, 90% of what they asked for, they continued right up until that bill was on the governor's desk to push for a veto of the inclusionary zoning requirements.
I mean, this is so obviously better than the status quo.
True. And I will say,
them.
That being said, sometimes with folks that are like that, where they're just never going to come around, I just try to listen as much as I can to what they need, incorporate as much as I can, and then just keep pushing forward. And, doors always open, tables always open. I want everyone to be a part of this conversation. But if you don't want to work collaboratively and fairly, then, we go forward. Like the work doesn't stop just because some people want to take their toys and go home.
But it's fair to say, and this makes me happy, so I'm suspicious of it, but it's fair to say then that really the motive force for this was housing people. Like the housing people now are organized enough that they are making actual bills happen. This is not some bank shot where you like sold it under other cover. It really is a housing thing.
Yeah. And I think similar to rent stabilization, similar to the middle housing bill, you also have this growing cohort of legislators coming in. My cohort, the cohort that just came in this year, who are people in their 30s and 40s who are directly connected to generations of folks who are trying to buy homes or rent homes, trying to build families and lives here, and who are more impacted by the way the housing market is now, as opposed to some of my colleagues who maybe bought their houses in the 90s.
Yes. This is such a generation gap on housing specifically. There is such a generation gap.
And I think the newer folks coming into are more kind of open to different ways of living that are not just like every family in a single family home in a picket fence neighborhood. And that's been great. And I don't want to run down all my colleagues, because all of my older colleagues, because we had many supporters, many housing folks been working on this for a long time. But I think it's both like the constant pressure on legislators to figure out housing solutions that feel big and impactful to constituents. And then the kind of growing number of legislators for whom these kind of housing solutions, like for me, doing this kind of work is the whole reason I decided to run for the legislature. It's the whole reason that I wanted to come in, because I didn't feel like there were enough people in the legislature from my age group and generation. Again, I'm 38, that understand what it's like out there for us and are acting with an urgency to address that issue.
It's funny, the Republican woman in Montana who sponsored a ton of Montana's recent very progressive housing legislation is, I think, 28, like one of the youngest legislators ever in Montana. I think that's definitely no coincidence.
Yeah, and Republicans care about this issue too. I mean, I got some Republican votes for this bill out of committee, not on the floor, but then I tend to be one of the more outspoken members of the caucus. I'm not heavily endeared to the Republican leadership.
They don't want to give you a victory.
Yeah, they're not so excited about all the dunking that I do on them on Blue Sky. So.
But on the substance behind the scenes,
some of them get it. I definitely had Republican partners and allies and people who, wanted to be involved in the bill, who had reasonable requests. And, I think that's great. I want to work with my Republican colleagues if they have a similar goal as I do on these issues. And so, it wasn't a full-throated rah-rah, but definitely a lot of support behind the scenes, and a lot of sometimes it's not even the yes vote you need so much as the can you just get everybody to chill out a little bit and not make 50 speeches against the bill. So with this bill eats up a ton of time. Time is always something we're managing in part-time legislatures where we only meet.
Tell me if this resonates. It's another thing you want from your Republican colleagues is just don't go yelling to Fox News about don't draw the eye of Sauron, because then they'll make the whole country full of conservatives.
Exactly. Yeah. I don't want to be written up in the Daily Mail. If
they're just quiet about it, just don't draw a ton of attention. That's maybe their best contribution.
We like low drama legislating.
Yes.
That's what this is for.
Alex, I didn't leave a ton of time for this, but I am curious to hear from you. This is the YIMBY movement is just gone from 0 to 60 in an incredible short span of time. They're fanning out across the nation, winning all kinds of victories. So maybe give us a little sense of how this TOD bill in Washington compares to TOD bills either passed or sort of on the table in other states. How well are we doing here?
Yeah, I think the exciting thing is that Washington State is really setting the bar on TOD.
You think this is the best state bill on TOD that's passed anywhere?
Yes.
Yes,
I do. And, and I think it's a credit to Representative Reed's leadership on this and all of the work that she was just describing to make a really impactful, big deal policy happen, and that this is something that the rest of the country is going to be looking at. When we look around at other states and what they're doing, a lot of places are trying to do something similar, which is great.
And these are all basically along the basic model of allowing more density around transit stops. They're all versions of that, basically.
Yeah. So there are two states that have done something kind of similar, Colorado and Massachusetts. And I think that the big difference is in the amount of density that we're seeing. In Washington State, we're using this wonky metric floor area ratio. The other states use, units per acre. So we tried to do kind of an estimate of how the floor area ratio translated into units per acre so that we could compare these a little bit better. And based on those estimates, right, we're getting a lot more density than those previous policies that were passed in those states. So we estimate it's about 175 homes per acre for the rail stations and about 125 for the bus rapid transit stations. That compares to, in Massachusetts, we're talking about 15 homes per acre as the minimum around transit. And
Wait,
then,
on the far side of reform? Because like, what was it before?
yeah, well, so like a typical single family neighborhood is maybe 5 units per acre. So you're getting an increase,
Yeah, I guess.
but it's,
Hey, those patriots need their space, Dave.
and obviously these are the floors, right? So I think they're spurring, hopefully, folks other opportunities to organize around doing more. And then in Colorado, it's 40 units per acre.
So we're winning, but I mean that's not a small margin. Then we're quite a bit ahead of the other competitors here.
Yeah, it's a big amount more. And I think there were criticisms during the advocacy process. One of the things that we had to do was convince people that this really was a big deal, because I think particularly with the floor area ratio, people hear 3.5 and they think, well, that's like 3.5 stories. That doesn't sound that big. And they go to Vancouver, BC, and they see these tall skyscrapers and they think, why can't we do that? So doing some of this comparison research and the analysis of like the overall total capacity we were adding was really important to emphasize, no, this is a big deal.
You could say, if I just throw this in here as a
Yeah.
political economy note, you could say that legislation that appears like no big deal to the casual observer, but is a big deal to the people who know and care and understand, is really like the ideal political sweet spot for getting your legislation through.
Yeah, for sure. But at the same time, we did have a problem where we needed the advocates to keep showing up. And so we had to show that this was a big deal and it was worth investing time in. So it's sort of a fine balance. You don't want to energize the other side too much, but you want to make sure that your people are energized,
Right.
that this is going to be worth putting all the time and energy into. And the other comparison that I think is helpful on this front, California has been working on passing a similar type of policy for a number of
They
years.
just did. Am
It
I?
just passed the Senate and still has to pass the House and get signed by the governor. But I hear from folks in California that the Senate was, they thought, their biggest hurdle. So,
Yes, that's what I hear too. Yeah.
fingers crossed that they're able to get their policy across the finish line this year too. But that is similarly, my understanding is around rail stations, a range of 60 to 120 units per acre, bus stations 60 to 100 units per acre. So,
Pretty good.
I hope we can be some motivation to them too to bump up some of those
Yeah.
density levels as well.
So you said Colorado, Massachusetts, California. Anywhere else of note?
Well, those are the states that are doing the most specifically connected to transit. I think there's a lot of other places that are doing other types of housing reform that'll make it easier to build apartment buildings. There's a bunch of states that have passed laws that legalize apartments in commercial areas. So like, making it legal so that a shopping mall could start building apartments on top of the stores, things like that. That's also going to cover like a lot of places. And so, we've seen reforms like that in Montana, Texas, Connecticut, Arizona to different extents. There's some, other policies happening in New Hampshire, in Hawaii. We're seeing city level changes in New York City, which obviously is bigger than most states in the country. So there's a lot of places where we're seeing exciting progress kind of on related but slightly different fronts.
Speaking of related but slightly different fronts, I guess now Washington has done middle density. They're sort of enabled a bunch of middle density. They have now killed parking minimums for the most part. We've legalized transit-oriented development now. Is there an obvious next, and Representative Reed, please feel free to hop in here too. Is there an obvious next target?
It is a topic of strong debate. Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's a couple places that we're kind of digging into. I mean, one thing, a lot of stuff happened this last legislative session, and so we're in a good position of getting to think now about what's next. I think some of the stuff that you guys were talking about earlier in terms of how do we not just have the density, but create great neighborhoods?
Yes, this is what I'm trying to lead to is like, is there a clear like state level lever that you can pull that affects that affects like the quality of the density? I'm not really sure what it would be.
I'm really interested in that question.
Well, no, I mean, I think it's something we're trying to figure out. I think that typically that's where we've done more work at the local level and really thinking about the local context. And so I think as we've tried to scale up to the state level so that we can have this bigger statewide impact, it's a little harder to figure out how do you scale up those things into state legislation. The one thing that we got a little bit of with the TOD bill this year that I think we're really interested in more of is state investment in the infrastructure for those neighborhoods. So
Right.
bicycle and pedestrian improvements, utility improvements, public space, placemaking investments, those kinds of things. And so I think that's one area for sure.
Yeah, I think that's an area of big interest. There is a fund that's created within this bill related to capital improvements for cities in TOD zones. And we'd like to see that grown to be a larger investment that cities can tap into. That's obviously something cities are very interested in as well. So I think that that is an area that we're going to continue to look at. We had some significant budget challenges with this year, so there wasn't really like a big pool of money we could tap into. But I think that's something where we want to kind of see that continue to grow, especially as the law begins to take effect and these TOD zones and planning zones come online.
I mean, a lot of the objection, a lot of the resistance to bills like this, you get people who live in one of these proposed areas who look around and say, well, like, there's a transit stop, yeah, but otherwise we're not really set up for this. We're not really set up for car-free living.
Yeah. And it's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem, right? Like
Exactly.
cities haven't invested in sidewalks in a particular area because they're not expecting a lot of housing to be in that space. You know, water tables, drainage, sewage, that always comes up a lot.
All that stuff.
So some of it is if we never plan for the housing there, we will never have the investment to support the infrastructure. But of course, if you're a city and you're worried about kind of being caught in that crunch, it's obviously a topic of big concern. And I think there's a way that like the state and cities can try to partner better on that.
Interesting stuff. What a great problem to have, Talia. Like, we did the big things. What's
Yeah, I
what
mean,
else
I
can
think
we
a
do?
lot of what we're going to be working on now is implementation. You know, anytime you put a bill together, you're like, this is how I think this bill is going to play out in real life.
Exactly.
But as I used to work on the executive side before I switched over, or I joined the legislature, and I know having implemented or tried to implement many pieces of legislation, there are always challenges that are unforeseen. So we're excited about that. I'm excited about kind of the bigger question that you raised too about enforcement. You know, I love our folks at Futurewise. They do such incredible work, but do we need a state housing office? Do we need to kind of break some of this housing work and enforcement out of the Department of Commerce? How do we create more teeth in enforcement for these housing laws? So there's a lot of work to be kind of done on the like enforcement implementation piece now that we've gotten some of these big hits on the books, and then also kind of dialing those things. Like as we start to see middle housing and eventually TOD take hold, is 3.5 FAR too low? You know, once you establish the principle, it's a lot easier to do a bill to say, oh, we're just going to like bump the FAR up 0.5.
Yes. We'll get those skyscrapers eventually.
Yeah. Skyscrapers in Sumner one day, but or maybe not. Maybe it's like, ooh, that was too much. We gotta scale back. So I'm excited to be a part of those implementation conversations and that legislation going forward.
Awesome. And Alex, that's probably next for Futurewise too, I guess. It's just trying to make sure this all goes off well.
You know, it's always going to be an iterative process. And I think one of the lessons we've learned is passing the bill is just the first step, and seeing things through to actually homes on the ground, neighborhoods for people is the work. And so, there's always more to do, but I think this is like a huge step to make all of that possible.
Amen. Thank you both. This has been super fascinating, and I really can't wait to see what you come up with next. I can't wait for the next session. What a weird, having these positive feelings about politics is so unnatural. It feels so unnatural to me. What is this feeling? So thank you. Thank you both for coming on and walking through those.
Yeah, it was great to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for listening to Volts. It takes a village to make this podcast work. Shout out especially to my super producer, Kyle McDonald, who makes me and my guests sound smart every week. And it is all supported entirely by listeners like you. So if you value conversations like this, please consider joining our community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf, or leaving a nice review, or telling a friend about Volts, or all three. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.